Imagine that each morning when you wake up, you're smiling and looking forward to your day, knowing that you're happy even while dealing with grief and loss. The Grief and Happiness podcast inspires, comforts, and supports you with each new episode. For more support, check out the Grief and Happiness Handbook and cards. I welcome you to listen to this podcast and discover endless possibilities for your life. Aloha. I am so happy you've joined us today. We have a very interesting talk that turns out for me to be hitting closer to home than I ever dreamed it would have when we decided to have this conversation. And as you know, I'm a writer, and I've written a couple of books on grief, and I strongly advocate people writing to help them deal with their grief. And that's exactly what Marsha has done. And her very first book is coming out, and she wrote it about her experiences and in a way that needs to be shared. So I'm very happy to welcome Marsha here today. Hi, Marsha. Can you tell us a little bit about you?
Well, I'm Marsha Gray Hill, originally from North Carolina, but I live in Florida. I've been in Florida about 27 years. I'm a mother of 5. And I have 15 grandchildren.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that's kind of been my life until I decided to write this book.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's so exciting to have so many grandchildren.
Yeah, it is. It's amazing.
I read in the introduction to your book that your daughter wrote. I was so touched by that she was so close with your mother, right?
Right.
And you, and I could see how much she loved you both and respected you, and it was just such a kind thing. And I had a feeling of what a wonderful person you are just for reading that, and it really made me want to read the book by reading that. So
you're so sweet.
Oh, well, tell her she impressed me. So
I will.
So tell us about your book, why you wrote it, what the book's about.
Well, it's about my mother, Adeline Gray. It's a story about her life, and it's also a story about how she died during the pandemic. It was early in the pandemic. And she wasn't just a number. She was like one of the thousands of people that died. She was an extraordinary woman who lived an extraordinary life. She touched everybody that she met. She was always taking care of the sick, taking care of the poor. Even though she was poor, she always gave. She took care of the handicapped. She was just patient, kind. One of my endorsers wrote she was the most godliest woman they'd ever met. So it was so I wrote it to honor her, but to also tell the story about how she died, because she wasn't allowed to die with dignity. And losing a mother is hard enough as it is, but then when it was very traumatic like that, and she also had dementia, and eventually she had Alzheimer's, and so she became my child. So I tell the whole story about how I had to start taking care of her, and how it just happens when you don't expect it to happen, and you never expect that to happen to you anyway. And so it's just how I learned how to juggle my family and taking care of her, and how to find caregivers, and, just this whole journey of that process, and what I, learned from that, of how you have to be an advocate for them because they just can't do it, or no longer can do it for themselves. And if you're not there for them, it can be very sad. So I just learned a lot, but that was the main reason I wrote the book. Was I was very angry when she died, and I know that's one of the stages of grief. And so I was just telling a friend about my story, and she's like, "Oh, you should write a book." I'm like, "I can't write a book. I've got a lot of books in my head. I've always said I was going to write a book, but I never really thought I would." And so she kind of harassed me for several months. And so I finally just caved, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, what have I done? I can't write a book."
Wow. That's it's such an experience. I know I never thought I'd be in a position of taking care of my mom, or that she wouldn't be the bright, healthy person that she had always been.
Right.
And you just, when it slowly sinks in that, oh, this is happening now, and I have to take charge. And it wasn't something I expected, so I understand what you're talking about. My mom's
Right.
situation was kind of different. She died long before the pandemic. That she had a form of dementia that was caused by a certain kind of brain tumor that she had that they couldn't operate on.
Mm.
And so she would go back and forth between being absolutely mom to being someplace else. She'd be
Yeah.
sitting there, you'd be sitting there with her, and she'd be talking to somebody in the room that wasn't there. And that was disconcerting as we watched that. She lived with my husband and I for quite a bit, until she just wanted to go home so bad. I always told her she could go home if she'd allow 24-hour care, but she couldn't go home unless she did. And she
Right.
wasn't going to have anybody in her house. And finally she said, I really want to go home. And I said, well, you know the rules. And she said, all right. So she got to go home and be home for the last few months that she was alive. But it's so, watching a parent go through something like that and doing the things that you never thought you'd be doing. Because
Right.
my mom was kind of funny, and actually she would try and hide from us. And we had a swimming pool, and we were terrified she was going to go out and get in the pool. So we really had to keep a close eye on her. And I was very active in the community, and so I started having meetings for things at my house because I couldn't take her anyplace, and I couldn't leave her by herself. So one day we were sitting in my living room, and I had my back to the window that faced out to the street, and I was watching everybody watch like this. They were just going, and I thought, what are they looking at? Because they weren't looking at me. I was right in front of them, but you could see them like a tennis match where everybody looks all in the same direction. And I turned around and saw my mom running down the middle of the street, laughing hysterically. She just thought it was so funny that she escaped.
Yeah.
So, and you never think of your mom doing something
that.
like that.
Yeah.
So trying to be prepared, I don't think you can be prepared, because you don't know what's going to happen until it happens.
No, exactly. And we moved. I ended up moving my mom from North Carolina to Florida. And one day she decided, I had her in assisted living. And one day she decided she loved the beach. And you had to cross this real big bridge to get from where she lived. The assisted living was right at this bridge. And you had to cross the whole intercoastal to get over to the beach. She took off out of her little apartment, walked across that bridge, and somebody found her 5 miles from home on the beach.
Wow.
Yeah, and they had called the police, and of course they called me. So that was one of the signs that we started seeing of her getting the whole dementia thing. So like you said, you don't know when it's going to happen. It just happens. And she would hide things all over the apartment, and almost caught the apartment on fire one time. And so we started seeing all those little signs way before COVID. And so that's when I ended up moving her down the street from me. So she was like a quarter of a mile from my house for like the last 8 years of her life. And that's when she needed full-time care. But you still don't think it's going to happen to you. And how are you going to find the right people? Because I'm kind of a control freak, and I'm so picky about who's going to be with her. And when you can't be with her every second, you got to really research and try to find the right people. And so I'd go through these agencies, and then most of the time they'd tell me, oh, I'm sending the best person I've got. And then it would just be who's available, because it's a business, And then when they have dementia, as you know, they need consistency.
Mm-hmm.
And so the whole different people all the time just wasn't working. And so we ended up word of mouth, thank goodness, finding some good care for her. But then when COVID started, early 2020 is when we had a caregiver that called in sick with a cold.
Mm.
And I said, of course, don't come back to work, but it was too late. We were told she had double pneumonia, but then we found out 2 days before she died that it was COVID. I knew it kind of in the back of my mind, but I kept hoping it was pneumonia because we'd fought that before, and I was like, oh, we can do this. But it was such a struggle because I couldn't find. I chose not to take her to the ER. The doctor wanted me to take her to the ER. But with her dementia, I was like, I can't drop her off at the door. I don't know. First of all, she would have been so frightened, and I just could imagine her laying in a hallway, and, they can't speak for themselves when they're like that. And so I'm like, I just can't do it. And so my daughter was the PA, the one that wrote the foreword. And she's in Atlanta. And so she's like, Mom, if you take her, you'll probably never see her again, which would have been the case. And so I just had to kind of fight with the doctor and finally got home health. And then, there were heroes and not heroes because one of the caregivers fled and one stayed. And then, there were just little miracles that happened every day, but I had to fight and then turn it over to God because I kept trying to, everything was out of our control, early pandemic, and no one, we were fighting this disease that no one knew anything about. And so it was very traumatic. It was just heartbreaking. And I was watching her gasp for air for like days, trying to get oxygen. Her doctor was MIA a lot. And anyway, so my daughter ended up flying in when it was a no-no to get on a plane. The one that wrote the foreword,
Mm-hmm.
she was nursing a baby at the time, and she didn't bat an eye. She just got on the plane to come and take care of her grandmama. And hospice wouldn't come because it was, during those times, they were kind of making their own rules every day because they didn't know what to do either. But she was COVID pending, so they would only drop off medicine at the back door. And so my daughter, the one she's a beautiful soul. She took care of Mom until she died. And then nobody would pronounce her dead, so she even had to do that. And it was just, yeah. It was a crazy time. But I kept fighting because I know we're supposed to use our brains, but then at some point I had to let everything go because it was just out of my control. Everything was. And because I'm a planner, because I had so many children, and early on, I planned Mama's funeral like 2 years before she died because she wanted to be buried in North Carolina, beside my dad. And she was such an amazing person that I wanted her to have the best funeral on the earth. And again, that's what I got for planning because none of that happened because of COVID. And I'm like, why, God, is this happening to the most Christ-like human being I've ever met in my life? But this whole pandemic was not anything planned by anybody for sure. But I do think that God was looking out for me and Mama every day because every time I would, give up, then some angel would appear. And that helped me through it. So it was just a very difficult time. But
Can you tell us?
She died 2 days after the COVID test
Wow.
came back.
Can you tell us an example of one of those miracles that were happening?
Oh, well, the very first one was I was fighting with the doctor the day he wanted me to take her to the ER. And I'm like, I can't. And he's like, well, what do you want me to do? And I said, well, I'd love to have home health. And he's like, anyway, it was an hour of fighting. And so when I hung up the phone with him, I didn't know if he was it was on a Friday at 12, and they closed at Friday at 12. So he just really didn't want to be bothered with it. At 5 o'clock that day, I get a call from home health. So I knew he finally, gave in and called home health. And the lady says, well, I can send somebody tomorrow. And I said, oh, please, please send somebody tonight. I'm desperate. Somebody needs to look at my mom. She's really sick. And so she says, well, hold on a few minutes. And so she called me back and she says, you're in luck. She says, I've got somebody that'll come over right now.
Oh,
So this nurse came and his name was Javier. Javier. I keep saying his name wrong. And he was not supposed to be working that weekend. He had family coming in from out of town. And so he assessed mom and he said, I will come in the morning and start, fluids. And I was like, oh, no, you're not going to be able to get the IV. And because the last few times I'd take her to the ER, they could never get the IV in her. And so I was like, oh, no, I started panicking all of a sudden. And he said, oh, don't you worry. I'm a trained pediatric nurse and I'll bring the tiniest needles. And I'd been fighting with the doctor all day. So I was just kind of like exhausted from just trying to figure out, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And when he said that, I just burst into tears. And I knew he was God sent. And he never left my mom aside. He didn't go home to his family. He just felt the need to stay with her because he knew I was like desperate. He could tell. And he's actually coming to my launch party next week because he's still an angel in our lives. And so he was our first little miracle that happened along the way. But he was just an angel. And there were lots more. We had a caregiver that ran when she found out mama was positive. And then we had one that slept in the bed with my mama and stayed with her till she died. So she's another angel. And then I would be fighting for oxygen and the doctor wouldn't answer. And it was a weekend. And I'm thinking, why didn't he give her oxygen? She's 91. You're telling me she's got double pneumonia and no oxygen was, prescribed, or she basically got one bag of fluids. And and it was so I would be like, God, please send somebody to find. And finally, then we would finally get the call in, and the little boy would be bringing the oxygen, but he had all these stops ahead, but he would hear in my voice that how desperate I was. And so he rushed to us. And then the same thing with the COVID test. And it was just, I had to fight every step of the way. I was out on the sidewalks begging people, do you have a doctor that I can call? Because my doctor's not answering, or my doctor's not showing up for the Zooms. And then I had a friend that was a pulmonologist. And so the only way I knew when to give mama more oxygen or less oxygen, or the nurse knew, was to call him, and he would FaceTime us. So he was another angel. And my daughter was an amazing angel because my mother taught her how to give. My dad was a diabetic, insulin shots when my dad had diabetes. And so she was about 11 and she wanted to give the shots. And so my mom taught her how. So she always gave my daddy his shots. And so it's just so crazy how this crazy virus that was out of our control, but yet my mama taught my daughter how to care for others. And then, it came back full circle that my daughter was the one that ended up taking care of her grandmother that had taught her how to give to others. Because if anybody in the community needed a wound dressed from a surgery or something, they called my mama. If they had a panic attack, they called my mama. She'd run over. If they needed a ride anywhere, she carried them. And she was just that. I never saw her do one thing for herself in my entire life. She went to other countries to tell people on her 2 little vacations in her whole life. She went to other countries to tell people about God. And so it was just crazy that my daughter ended up being the one. So that was very traumatic for my daughter, but very beautiful too, So
That's so wonderful. I'm touched about you planning your mom's funeral and then not being able to get to do it. I think it's wonderful that you had the opportunity to plan it though, because you thought about all those things. And now you've written about those things. And, a funeral lasts for an hour or two at the most, but you've got it in a book so that your whole family can know all those things that you planned for forever. And they're your grandchildren and your great grandchildren, and that your mom is going to live forever in that book that you wrote.
Exactly. Exactly. I have a little granddaughter, and she's 9, but she's an amazing reader. I mean, if you see her, she's always got her head in a book. So she was at my house a couple of weeks ago, and the new hardbacks had just arrived for the launch party, and I showed her one, and she went, her eyes they just tripled. She was so excited. And so I said, well, don't worry, Charlotte, Grammy's going to write a little something in a book and give you a book. And I could tell she was a little disappointed. I said, oh, you want a book right now? And she went, yes. And so I said, okay, I'll give you this one, and I'm still going to write one for you. And about 5 minutes later, I go in the living room, and her head is already in the book she's reading. And so the next day, my son said that she didn't want to go to school because she wanted to keep reading it. And it just touched my heart. And that night, about 10 o'clock, I get a picture on, message on my phone. And it was her in the bed clutching the book. And she was fast asleep. And I was like, oh my gosh, it just melted my heart. And so she's going to go with me to my first little book signing, and she's going to talk about the book.
That
So
is
she's
so
read
wonderful.
the book.
Yeah.
I know. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is why this is so important. Like you said, my grandchildren will know about their great grandmother forever and how special she was. And I thought, there's a lot of times I really wanted to throw the book in the trash can because it wasn't easy for me because I'm really not an author. And it was just been a hard journey. And so, but every time I was about to give up, I would get an email from somebody that had been to my website and read a little bit about it. And they'd say, oh, thank you. This book is going to help me. And then they'd tell me their whole story about what happened to them with their loved ones. And I'd say, okay, God, I'll keep trying. I'll keep trying to do this book. And so somehow we've made it to the end, but it's been with a lot of miracles, angels, and with God's help too, for sure.
That's so wonderful. I really believe in the power of writing and the power of reading and what you can do, how many people you can touch, how many people you can help. And with encouraging other people to write, I just see wonderful things happen to them by going through that process of writing about something. I talk a lot about storytelling, that I really think that when stories are especially important to you, you've got to tell them until you're done telling them. And you'll get to a point where you don't have to, the story gets shorter and shorter as you tell it, and you don't have to say so much. I know when my husband, who died he was the first of my 2 husbands who died, and it was so sudden that something came on. He'd been sick for a long time with different things, with diabetes and things, but just all of a sudden we had this medical emergency, and it went on for like a week and a half from when we recognized it to after he'd had the surgery, the 7 bypasses. I didn't know they could do 7 bypasses, but when people would ask me about him, they said, well, what happened? And when they first did that, it'd take me over an hour to tell them what happened, And the more I told it, I got to the point where I didn't have to tell all of it anymore. I'd say, something was really wrong, and we got him to the doctor, and they got him into surgery, and he's doing really well now. And that took me less than a minute to say that. But when I first started telling the story, it was so long because it was part of my process. I had to go through that to get there. And by writing your story yourself, you can do that. It helps you with your process. It helps you, like with the funeral you planned. That's all in the book. You got to have everything you wanted for that funeral there. It wasn't in the place where you thought it was going to be or in the way you thought it was going to be, but your writing allowed you to have that experience.
Gosh, I hadn't thought of it that way. That's beautiful. I'm glad you said that. Because and that's the other thing about these podcasts, they're new to me. And so I'm like rambling and telling these long stories. And I'm like, maybe that's part of my process too, but it's boring other people.
Oh, I don't think it's boring because it's the first time they've heard it. And I think that that's significant. I think the first people that I told that big long story about Jacques to appreciated it just as much as the one that I gave the short story and told him, and he's doing well now, because they got to the point that he's doing well now was what they really wanted to hear.
Wanted to hear, yes.
But I seemed to have the right story for the right person when I was telling it to them as I went through that process.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really encourage people to write it down, write what they're feeling, what they're experiencing, and share about their loved ones and the special things about them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was very hard with grieving Mom because I felt like I grieved her. I started grieving her a long time ago when she wasn't the mother that was so confident and so strong that I grew up knowing. And then you're still grieving her, and then she dies, and then you're grieving her again. And then all of a sudden, it's like you feel like an orphan because even though she was your baby, she's still your mom, and you always need your mom. And it's so I think that was the difference between my dad. He had my mom as his she was his caregiver. Mm-hmm. But then when mom became my child, she was like my full responsibility. There was nobody else. I had, my brother was in North Carolina. It was just all me. And it just really, then the whole guilt comes in. Did you do the right thing? Did you hire the right people? Should I have gone to the ER? It's just, and you relive that writing the book too. I think it's very therapeutic to go through that whole process and kind of analyze it as you go and learn to give yourself a little grace and other people grace, because early in that pandemic, I was just very angry at all these people that didn't show up. But I realize now everybody was scared. It was a difficult time. And I was scared some too. I was scared.
Oh, sure. Of course.
And I was trying to go by the rules that I was told. Don't go see your mom 14 days because early on we had been to Disney with the kids. And so that's when she started getting real weak. And I was standing outside the door because I was trying to go by the rules when I was seeing her. And then if I could have just gone in earlier, well, I should have, but I was trying to do the right thing. But anyway.
You're talking about a couple different things there. One of them is anticipatory grief. I think people don't realize that anticipatory grief is something that a whole lot of us experience. Because we think you grieve when somebody dies. You don't think about grieving them while they're still alive. Mm-hmm. And that's a real common experience that people have. And when they're surprised by it, it just makes it that much harder. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that you mentioned was the guilt. Guilt is people really deal with a whole lot of guilt, and they don't need to feel guilty about it. I had an experience with my mom that I felt so guilty about because she lived out of town and she'd come down to spend the weekend with us, and she wanted to buy an electric blanket. And so we went shopping and found her an electric blanket, and she went home, and I didn't call her when she got home, or she didn't call me. And I thought we really should have done that, but we didn't. And that was on a Sunday. And on Tuesday, I got a phone call saying that I own a company, and the house she was living in was on the property of the company. And she always played bridge on Tuesday mornings with her friends, and she didn't show up. And so her friends called the company and they said, you need to go check on Hazel because she's always here. And they went in and found her on the floor. She had been trying to put that electric blanket on the bed by herself on Sunday and fell and couldn't get up. She didn't break her hip or anything. She just couldn't get up. We don't really know why. And she was in bad shape by the time they found her.
Oh
She
my
was
goodness.
dehydrated and everything, but she couldn't get to a phone. She couldn't, and I felt so guilty about that. And it took me a long time to realize that it wasn't my fault.
Right.
It was something that happened.
Yeah, just
And
bad things happen.
yeah, and as soon as anybody, I was so grateful that she played bridge with those ladies from the time that she first got married, and she'd been married 53 years. So actually, it
Wow.
was longer than that because she was married for 53 years, and then she lived another 7 after Dad died. So they've been playing bridge for a long time. So they knew that
News.
something
Yeah.
wasn't right. And they did the right thing by calling. Everything was the right thing. The only thing is I wish I would have thought to call her earlier, and I didn't. And I beat myself up about that for a long time. And that didn't help me to beat myself up about it.
Right.
So it's always think about what, could you have done something different? Would it have made, that much of a difference? But just don't dwell in that guilt, whatever it is, when you feel the guilt. And when you feel angry, feel what you got to feel.
Yeah.
And you'll work your way through it. And once you tell your anger story often enough times, you don't have to tell it anymore.
Exactly. The anger diminishes a little bit each time.
Yeah. And I'm sure the book helped with that, because now look at you, you're smiling and kind of laughing, and you think, gee, I did that,
Exactly.
But you're good, you're good.
Yeah.
Well, gee, I've enjoyed this conversation so much. I'm so excited for you about your book signing and getting to have this launch and get your book out there into the world, and the gift it is to your family and friends and to all the people that will read it that are in similar circumstances. I think it's a really good idea when people are in the middle of dealing with something, if they can find a book like this to read, to see somebody else had issues trying to deal with what was going on. And so I'm not the only one, because a lot of times we feel like we're the only one going through these experiences. And by reading somebody else's book, that can really help too. And your book can be that kind of comfort to people.
Yeah. And I just wanted to help others because my mama was always helping others. So that's all that matters.
Yeah. So what a gift to your mom. That's just a wonderful thing that you were able to do for her, or are able to continue doing for her. That's
Yes.
a wonderful thing. So thank you so much for doing this. Everybody get a copy of Grief and Grits and enjoy that. And I think of the wonderful person that Marsha is for doing this. And you're it's gonna be a great success. And I'm very happy for you.
Oh, thank you so much. And thanks so much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. And we'll have in the show notes the link where you can get more information about the book and be able to get your very own copy. So thanks for listening, and I'll listen or be here for my listeners again next week. Aloha. Do you want more comfort and support and happiness? Join the Grief and Happiness Alliance at our free gatherings on Zoom every Sunday. Visit my website at griefandhappiness.com and read my books, The Grief and Happiness Handbook, and get your set of the beautiful Grief and Happiness cards. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast, rate it, review it, and binge listen to all of our episodes. I can't wait to welcome you back to another episode of the Grief and Happiness Podcast.